on today's show.
I think giving some geographic and historical context to where I grew up is probably helpful. I grew up in a small farm town in Northern California. And despite it being only an hour and a half from San Francisco, it really is a farm town. It may as well be the middle of Nebraska.
Hey, I'm from Nebraska, by the way. Come on,
I chose that totally at random.
I love it though, yeah. And I love your line that you describe it as like. I think you introduced this in the foreword of your book. You say you were an elementary and a college dropout.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Creator Institute podcast. Your host, Koester.
How's it going, everyone? The first thing that's going to strike you about today's episode is when we meet Dale Stevens, is when he describes himself as dropping out of school at 5th grade and then dropping out again after his first semester in college. Dale Stevens has had an incredibly interesting early life. He does talk on the show about his decision to say the formal education system growing up wasn't for him and deciding to go and do homeschooling when he was really young, going on saying, all right, now I'm going to start college, and ultimately feeling like that wasn't the fit for him. He's had some really interesting experience. He wrote a book. He has started a company called Uncollege. He's been all over the place. He was a Teal Fellow. And we talk a lot about that sort of journey of creating and taking the elements of feedback into that process. We talk about his book, which he is described as, the title of it is Hacking Your Education, which is published by Penguin and is a best-selling title. He talks about, in some ways, the first version of this book was really, really, really anti-education, and it walks back from there. We talk a little bit about how that decision, how he got feedback, outside of the formal bounds of education, how he was able to get feedback from mentors to really make sure that he could send a message of hope and ultimately kind of share with people how to really own their education. Whereas he started out saying, screw the education system. And today I think he realizes that the education system can be a great fit for most people, but what's important in it is owning your own trajectory. Dale's a great guy. I think you'll enjoy our conversation. He pulls no punches as we go along, which I enjoyed. And I think he's someone who's been able to talk about the future of work and education to audiences everywhere from TED to New York Times. He's been named a 30 under 30 in education by Forbes. And I think he's someone that is continuing to discover the power of the creator. And I think we have many interesting things to look forward to ahead. Dale Stevens, everyone, the author of Hacking Your Education. Dale Stevens, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for spending some quality time with me. And it was sort of fun for you and I before we got on to sort of reminisce about the hazy periods in which we both met. I was in the middle of starting a company. You were in the middle of a Teal Fellowship and starting a company. So I'm glad we got to chat here almost like 7 or 8 years after that first time we met way back when. Yeah, it'll be 7 years in January since I officially dropped out of college. It's crazy. Well, and we'll talk about how you never look back in some ways. So I love it. Well, I think I'm going to start with a quote that from an article you wrote in Fast Company, and the quote goes like this. You wrote, "I learned early to live by the words of Mark Twain, and quote, have never let my schooling interfere with my education." So what resonates with you about that quote in particular, from youth even to today, that you think about that sort of encapsulates you? I think giving some geographic and historical context to where I grew up is probably helpful. I grew up in a small farm town in Northern California. And despite it being only an hour and a half from San Francisco, it really is a farm town. It may as well be the middle of Nebraska. Hey, I'm from Nebraska, by the way. Come on, I chose that totally at random. I love it though. Yeah. There you go. But it's a small farm town where what is valued is football on Friday nights, not academics. And so I ended up leaving school at the end of 5th grade, basically because I wanted to get an education, and that was really because the public school system was not designed to educate. It was designed to pass the bare minimum, get students out the door, and make sure everyone was entertained on Friday nights. The teachers who worked there
although mostly well-intentioned, weren't really interested in challenging themselves or creating any extra work for themselves, which means they didn't challenge their students.
Yep.
And mediocrity was, it was what was valued was mediocrity, not learning or challenge or progress, right? And so that's really where that started. So I ended up leaving school at the end of 5th grade. I got very lucky. There was the town that I grew up in is just west of Davis, California, which has UC Davis, which I think has at the time it had the second highest per capita number of PhDs after New Haven, Connecticut.
Really? That's
so it was
fascinating.
a very educated town. And it turned out that many of the professors were homeschooling and unschooling their children. And so we found this ad in the local newspaper for a, quote, not back to school night, where everyone who was making an alternative choice to going to public school got together and planned out what they were going to do collaboratively. So I was 11, I think. I was at the beginning of 6th grade. And it was, what was really amazing was that there was a community that had a vocabulary and a framework and a philosophy for what my parents and I were trying to wrap our heads around and describe. And so making a choice that was alternative became a lot less scary once we saw, there's 30 other people who are doing the exact same thing, right?
Right.
As well as, realizing that what became 6 years outside of school was initially, we'll take a year off.
Right.
And we can always go back. And then it became, I'll go back to high school because, I'll have to, do science requirements and pass the SAT. Yep. And of course, by the time I got to high school, I had, worked on political campaigns and started little small businesses and gotten to meet a whole bunch of interesting academic, intellectual friends. And I was like, why the fuck would I go back to middle school?
That's right.
And
that sounds like the worst idea.
And I don't know, every once in a while, someone will be like, aren't you sad that you missed out on middle school and high school? And I'm like, fuck no. I missed out on bullying and mediocrity and learning to entertain myself when I was bored as hell. No, who likes middle school? Right. Yeah, exactly. Awkward dancing, being shy in the locker room. Who actually likes middle school and high school? No one.
Yeah. No, not at all. The people, someone told me once before, it was funny. I was told, I think I was sort of in that similar boat. I didn't like high school or grade school. I felt out of place. And someone told me that the only people who like high school or loved that period of time, they won't like their life when they're middle-aged or whatever, so when they're in their 20s. And so it's one of those things that you get to pick which period you want. Pick it not that short, shitty period. Pick it when you're going to be a little bit older. And I think it's probably true. I remember the most popular kids in middle school and grade school today are not the people that I think are we would put at the top of the heap.
Right. Totally.
And I love your line that you describe it as, I think you introduced this in the forward of your book. You say, you were an elementary and a college dropout. So that was the I've heard of people being sort of college dropouts. That's not that it's not unusual, but it's not as unusual as saying you're an elementary school dropout. Did you ever wrestle with sort of some of those those feelings of sort of not oh gosh, maybe I should be part of the the marching band and having those things around? Did you ever feel that way?
Honestly, not really, but I've always had a very, very strong, blunt personality. I think if I were a different person, I would have felt very differently. I also think that there were a bunch of blessings in disguise of being outside the system that I didn't, I think I'm still realizing the value in to this day. And also a lot of the things that would have made me quote unquote weird being in school were sort of automatically blamed on being outside of school.
Interesting.
The one that particularly jumps to mind is that I'm gay, and figuring that out didn't really happen until much later because I wasn't in a reinforced heteronormative environment.
Interesting.
But had I been in middle school and high school, that would have stood out, that would have been picked on, and it probably would have stunted a bunch of other growth and development. I probably would have come out of the experience with a bunch of baggage.
Interesting.
But because I was outside the system, a bunch of things that would have potentially made me weird or the outsider were much easier to deal with and sort of blamed on not being in school, which didn't cause any long-term emotional or mental damage, because that wasn't about me, right? That was about a choice that I'd made.
Yeah, exactly. That's awesome. And so, but you did decide to to play into the pressures and re-enter the educational system in college. So what was that process to say, I guess now I should go to college, that went through your mind?
I realized pretty early on in the process of starting on college how hypocritical that seemed. Early on, the justification, particularly to my dad, who was, comes from a family of engineers, is sort of, as you would imagine, a very wrote in by the book kind of person.
Right.
One of the justifications was, look, like homeschoolers actually get into college at much higher rates than people who go to public school, which, initially might sound counterintuitive, but if you think about it for a second, actually makes a ton of sense. People have unique experiences, who have experience managing their time, etc., are going to make better college students. And so, when the time I was applying to college was sort of just at the windfall of when there were enough colleges on the national level who'd had homeschoolers come and had really good results, but they were really actively recruiting homeschoolers.
Interesting.
Like at the time, I recall Princeton's whatever they called it, had valedictorian, had been a homeschooler a couple of years before, and so they were like very actively recruiting homeschoolers. And of course, in the way in the college industrial complex, everyone copies the Ivy League, and so everyone was kind of following suit. And so initially was, well, actually homeschooling will help me get, do better on the SAT and get into better schools, which now looking back seems, so hypocritical to use a system.
Just what you knew at the time, right? I mean, I think it's, you didn't know any better, but I think in some ways it is interesting. I think that college, even to this day, I still see it. And I am both part of the system and outside of the system here as a professor at Georgetown, and also an entrepreneur who thinks like there's a lot of problems with the systems. It's interesting that there still is this huge, massive pressure on college is something that you have to do to get into the workforce. Right. I think there is a real big sense of that.
The thing that always boggles my mind about that is how little, in my experience, hiring people and helping people get jobs. There is very little that the decision points have very little to do with your actual experience or what you have done, and almost entirely to do with how you communicate your experience. Right. Which is never taught in college. I mean, a friend of mine. I met a friend's grandson just finished a law degree, and has been like driving for Uber. And they were like, "Oh, can you help our son get a job?" And it's like, I'd had a couple conversations with him. He seemed competent and like a good communicator. And then he sent me his resume. I was like, "Oh my God, you have no fucking clue how to write a goddamn resume." Yeah. Yep. Like, you're clearly a competent person. Like, I would hire you based off of the 2 hours I spent talking to you. But like, if you can't communicate, you're dead in the water.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we spend a lot of time telling people that it's success comes from association, not from action. And so it's a little bit of, I think there's this default, and I see it a lot with my students who say, I already did the work of getting into Georgetown. Now other people are going to say, hire me, simply because of that. The people who've already said I'm qualified. And I think that the world has shifted, right? Fundamentally shifted, even over the last 5 to 7 years, where now we have a track record and evidence that people can look at. And so I think you're probably even seeing your own experiences over the last 7 to 8 years. It's the world, I think, has flipped over even in that period of time, even more so.
Oh, completely. I mean, like the thing that boggles my mind the most is when I started on college 7 years ago, it was blasphemy to suggest that the system needed to change, right?
That's right.
And now, I talked, like, basically every single college president agrees that the system needs to change. They don't agree on how to do it.
Right.
But every single person thinks the system is broken and it needs to change. And that is a complete reversal of attitudes from 7 years ago, when I, would get hate mail from college administrators and professors. Saying that I was, devil incarnate.
Yeah. And you did, I'll fast forward a little bit. Not after that much time, you decided to drop out. And it wasn't as if, there's some people, I've read some of the people in their stories. So you would go on to get a Teal Fellowship, but some people link those together. Like, oh gosh, like I'm going to drop out because of this opportunity. You sort of dropped out without much of a parachute or a net behind you.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I had the parachute of having a family who, at the very least I could go and, they could feed me and give me a place to live.
Right.
But yeah, initially my parachute was I had spent a couple months working for the folks who started a company called Zinch, many of whom now do interesting things in the ed tech space. And Dwayne is a VC at Village Global. The founder, Mick Hagan, has gone on to start a company in London. One of the other founders runs a VC firm in Utah. Dave Blake and Chris McCarthy run Degreed, which is a huge player in the alternative credentialing space. But initially, my landing space was and was like, look, come over, do some work here for 20 hours a week, whatever you need to pay your bills, and you can hang out and figure out what you want to do with your life. So I feel very lucky that I at least had the initial landing space of having spent time in San Francisco and having, built the start of a network that was able to support me when I moved back.
Yeah, and I saw, not everyone, and still, I'm going to drop out of pursuing the streams. You didn't get all positive, hey, congratulations on doing this. I think there was a quote that I read that someone wrote you an email saying, you've fallen into an elaborate fantasy and need to wake up.
Yeah, that was a college student at the same college. I was like going through my Evernote the other day, and I found a copy of that email that I'd saved, and I was like, if I could only,
yeah.
It's like, what is that person up to now?
Yeah, usually that's what I want to figure. I was going to ask you if you followed up to see like what's the difference between the non-fantasy and the fantasy life. You should some research that you do. So
I believe he went to med school at Wash U.
Yeah.
Think.
So there, I think probably for him it made perfect sense, right? There is a sense that there's an achievement with a professional degree in mind. Okay, great. Not to say that your career path choice is any weirder, but it should be any weirder. It's just different. I think that's the important part.
Yeah, totally.
So I want you to tell a story that is in the early part of your book, the introduction, where the woman a woman asks you about your dating life in connection to your decision to drop out. Would you tell that? Because I thought it was fascinating to hear this woman's perception of what not going to college would actually cost you socially.
Yeah, and I will also preface this by saying, like, I wrote that story because it was funny, and it made a good story for the book. But the more time I've spent interfacing with students and professors and college presidents, the more I think that her point actually rings true and has a lot of valid sense. And is actually something that is never really considered for the design of higher education, but actually is something that really should be considered. Anyway, I was in the cafeteria, and woman's main concern about my dropping out of college was that I would miss out on all the beer and the girls in college, and my initial response was like, well, why is that important? And then a second later I was like, well, I prefer guys in Champaign. There's a hell of a lot more of that in San Francisco than there ever will be in Arkansas. But on a more serious note, like, I think that actually, a huge number of people meet their partners in college. A huge number of people have sex for the first time in college. Yeah. Like optimizing for sex and meeting partners is actually a huge value out of what college does.
Interesting.
And I think if anything, the only thing that I ever think that I potentially missed not going to college was that college has a monopoly on young single people.
Mm-hmm. Like, that's interesting.
Being a single 20-year-old in San Francisco was not a particularly great experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exacerbated by the fact that San Francisco is not a city that really has a lot of colleges. Had I been living in New York or DC, I probably wouldn't have that complaint. Yeah. But San Francisco is, not a place where it was very, very, I was very much the outlier to be a single 19-year-old, 20-year-old living in SF. Right. And it's so fascinating to see. So, at that initial core time when I left, there were maybe 20 to 30 of us who were within a couple of years of each other who had made the choice to not go to school. Mm-hmm. And now there's probably about 500 people in San Francisco who are, at this point, like under 28, because the oldest were a couple years older than me. But to be able to come here and say, I'm 19 and running a company and raise $10 million from Andreessen Horowitz and and am gay and like have 4 employees and have 20 employees, and to not be the only person,
Right.
like that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
That was not true when I started.
Yeah, that's the power of, community really does matter. And I think it's why you're seeing in some ways a lot of shifts towards this concept of creating communities that are these more niche things. I mean, it's, like I said, it started out as incredibly niche, 20 of you, right? And now to think that it's, 500, I think that just shows us that traditional structures of assimilation, which are, these colleges or these, those sorts of ways are starting to be changed. And the internet is certainly doing that, which it's an interesting point.
Right.
So tell me then a little bit about your transition. You're sort of on your own now. You're trying to figure it out, and you see this crazy new thing called the Teal Fellowship. What did you think, and why did you decide to go for it?
I didn't really put a lot of thought into it, to be totally honest. I think it was mostly, I had experienced 6 months of living part time in San Francisco. I knew that I'd found a community of other entrepreneurs that I really enjoyed. I was hating my first 6 to 8 weeks at school. I was bored mostly. I had gone from, and the interesting thing about self-education that I think most people don't realize is that it's a shit ton of work.
Yeah.
Because not only are you actually doing the learning, you're deciding what you're going to learn, and then you're figuring out how to assess what you learned.
Interesting.
And so college for me was like a reduction of 2/3 of my entire work. Suddenly someone else was doing the decision making of what I was going to learn and doing the assessment, and I had to do the work. So my attitude was like, oh, this is easy. Like, this is what I expected. And everyone else was like, oh my God, I have to write like a 2-page, science report or something. I was like, well, that should take you 45 minutes. What's the problem? And so fundamentally it wasn't a good culture fit.
Yep.
I think I did not choose the right environment. On the flip side, I ended up choosing a place that impacted the rest of my entire life for leaving. So
right.
Everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
But I now totally forgot the question that you asked.
No, I was asking about your, sort of decision to apply for the Teal Fellowship.
Yes. So I was looking for an out, right? And 100K in 2 years was an easy out that gave me a lot of time to think and explore and figure it out. I was not a shoo-in. I was initially rejected. I applied to start a low-cost transatlantic airline, believe it or not.
Really? That's amazing.
When I was like 17, I was running around Silicon Valley trying to convince people to give me money to start a low-cost transatlantic airline. Which at the time,
so at least you don't dream small.
Yeah, exactly. At the time, everyone thought was kind of ridiculous, but now Wizz Air and Norwegian are proving everyone wrong. So maybe in hindsight, it wasn't such a terrible idea.
Right.
I certainly didn't have the operational experience. So I was rejected, and I was like, whatever. College had picked up a bunch of steam, and I'd gotten lucky that I'd gotten a bunch of press. And I think that was really just being in the right place at the right time, being articulate, and also having an authentic story. Right. Yep. I was certainly not the first person to write the book that college is going to change. Anya Kamenetz, I think, can put a flag on the ground, and she does great work.
Yep.
But Anya has 2 parents who are professors at Yale, and that's just not a fun clickable story. A fun clickable story is like elementary school drops out of college and proclaims the end of higher education, right?
Yeah.
And so just a bunch of things conspired in the right way.
Yeah.
And so that's how the Teal Fellowship happens.
That's amazing. So tell me then, let's talk a little bit about the book that sort of came from this a little bit. What's interesting is you make a point and to say this book is not about dropping out, right? And to your point about being hypocritical in some ways, I think you make the statement to say, listen, not everyone should drop out, but everyone should have more sort of autonomy and ownership over the way that they learn in their education. What was that sort of a difference in the way that you decided to write? Like, it was originally to say like everyone should, like, higher education is over, and this was a way to sort of to take it back a notch, or how did that process go through as you came up with what was the big idea in the book?
I think what you're picking up on is that the longest piece of writing that I'd ever done before this book was like a 12-page paper in college. So I really wasn't a very experienced writer. And so I turned a lot to friends and mentors. who helped me turn what was basically like a series of blog posts railing against higher ed into what I actually am pretty proud of as a book. Like I think the book is cohesive. It has a storyline that's woven throughout. It has a bunch of tangible, actionable advice. People that I like and respect continue to tell me that they got value from the advice that was in the book. So I think it turned out well. But yes, it was originally much more vitriolic and railing against higher ed. And I was wise enough to at least listen to the advice that they gave me at that time, even if I didn't fully believe it myself at the time. But I definitely believe it now. I mean, I think what I learned from 4.5 years of running on college as a gap year program is that the vast majority of 18-year-olds aren't mature enough to have the self-control and self-awareness to succeed outside of a system. And that most people need some time between 18 and 22 to figure that out. I definitely don't think that that sending everyone to a 4-year college that costs $60,000 a year is the best solution for that in any way, shape, or form. But I would not agree with the statements that I made when I was 18 or 19 that suggested that anyone was capable of succeeding outside of school, no matter their own backgrounds at 18.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's in some ways what's the process of writing a book somewhat teaches you those. I think like you probably would have figured that out, but you figured it out in a much faster period of time by going through the process, listening, learning, versus like being very sort of, well, this is my experience. It should apply to everyone. And I think that's why I'm such a big believer in the process of writing a book. Just forces you to really come to terms with what you truly believe. Totally.
I mean, I feel like as I was over the course of the last year, as I was leaving on college and thinking about what to do next, a couple of people were like, well, like maybe you should go back and get a master's degree. And I like laughed at them initially. And then I was like, I like briefly considered the idea seriously for a moment. I was like, well, I basically have a master's in education and an MBA at this point. Like I wrote a thesis,
right? And
I like ran a business for 4 years. Like why would I possibly do that? But yeah, I mean, like even as we designed success metrics for college and the gap year experience, which is now a year on, what we designed as the graduation capstone experience was basically a thesis defense, a dissertation.
Interesting.
Where we ask each student to go before a panel of 3 staff members and talk about what they've learned.
That's interesting.
And they don't, we're not asking, they do some small written reflections, but mostly we're asking them to be articulate about why they did the program, what they learned from the program, what they took that they can change and impact going forward. The kinds of questions that you'd expect a first job interviewer or a savvy college admissions officer to get good answers to.
Yeah.
Because that's really the metric that you want to be evaluating for.
I was in a sort of a session with Ted Leonsis, who was one of the early folks at Revolution and now the owner of the Wizards. And he describes that he had 2 dissertation defenses while he was in college. And he asked like to the room very sort of in a very kind of like curious way. So do you guys have your dissertation or sort of your thesis defense? I think is what he called it. You defend your thesis to a panel of faculty members, and everyone looked at him like, no, we don't do that. And I thought he described it as something that was really great for him. Like it was something that helped him really think about himself. And it's interesting hearing you say that because it is an interesting thing. We almost never have someone really put enough time to be able to get hard questions from really smart people to be able to prepare for that first interview, whatever that's going to be. When you get tough questions, it's a surprising thing that we've gone so far away from that in education.
Yeah, it's true. We augmented this by adding we have everyone give a 2-minute presentation to everyone, to like staff, parents, friends, mentors, etc. And some of them are like really fucking good. Like every time they happen, a couple people like consistently make everyone cry. It's incredible.
In a world where communication matters so much, I think it is interesting that we emphasize multiple choice tests and those sorts of things over things that really do emphasize our ability to communicate.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about what the sort of how the book has changed. In some ways, the opportunities for you out of it. I mean, obviously, you're in the midst of launching a company while you're writing and publishing this book. You've had these other elements of credibility press, and you've been featured on like 4,000 different publications. How did the book itself help you stand out differently than maybe some of the other things you've been doing or done were?
For better or for worse, a book is still a credential, right? And having a book that was picked up by a major publisher, I think, is more of a credential to the vast majority of the world than the Teal Fellowship will ever be, right?
Interesting.
Being and this is probably less true now that Uncollege is well known and so on and so forth. But certainly being able to say, "Oh, Penguin is publishing my book," was an instant measure of credibility all over the world. In a way that, oh, I'm part of the Teal Fellowship that no one had heard of. And at this point, I tend not to associate myself with the Teal Fellowship as much as possible, because I would prefer refraining from supporting Peter's extravagant lifestyle. But it really functions and serves as a credential, and I think it particularly gave me access to spaces and ideas and people that I wouldn't necessarily have had access to otherwise. And also got my ideas in places, even sort of without my knowledge. And I have one particular example that I'll share that I think really helped influence and transform higher ed over the course of the last couple of years, and is one of the reasons that college presidents now say, this needs to change. We just don't know how. A couple of years ago, I think it was probably a year after the book came out, got an email from a guy who worked at the Aspen Institute, and was like, "Hey, like if you're ever in DC, I'd love to take you out to lunch. Our education program had 300 people read your book through the summer, and discuss it at the Institute." I'm like, A, why didn't you fucking invite me to come talk?
Exactly.
And B, that's cool. But it was entry into spaces like that, and I don't have a list of who those people were. I'm still friends with the person who did that. He worked in the Obama administration for a while, but that's one that I heard about, and I can only imagine that there were others that I didn't. And having those ideas percolate through 300 influential leaders, I'm sure, was part of what helped drive those ideas forward.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing what like I said, those things that you didn't know about just because someone else recommended to someone else. That next thing you know, your book opens those doors. It's pretty fascinating to see. What do you talked about? What some of the things that you might change in your book now that you've got the benefit of time? What are some of the things that you would say your perspective has been colored now that you write a book and 4 years later now you're sort of thinking about some of those elements? What's changed in your perception over that time?
I think the biggest thing for me is less about the book and more about having jumped into running a business at a young age. There's so much that I didn't know about being a good manager because I'd never managed people. I'd never been managed. I started a company as a sole founder. That was a stupid idea. It was incredibly, incredibly lonely. You can't talk to your employees. You can't talk to your investors. Your parents don't get it most of the time. There were just a whole bunch of things around that lead me to wish that I had taken a couple more years to learn before jumping into starting a company that I think ultimately would have made the company more successful, because also the company was a few years too early.
Right.
I look at what Eric Braun is doing with Mission U, and I wish him all the best and hope it goes well. But their messaging is almost exactly the same messaging that we had early on.
Right.
But we had to scale it back because the world wasn't ready for it. Right.
Yeah.
And I imagine, and I've given Adam lots of free advice. I imagine that they will have to scale back some of it, but I would certainly not suggest to a 19 or 20-year-old to go out and raise $2 million.
Right.
I would much more highly recommend to wait until you're at least 25 to start a company and have to deal with the pressure and stress of having other people be dependent on you and being responsible for the livelihood of other people's kids and like learning how to take your own mental and physical health seriously and, dealing with how your own brain physiologically changes until you're 25, just all those kinds of things. There's so much growth that happens between 20 and 25.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, when I was running a business, that took priority over my own personal growth. And that is something that I regret.
Yeah. It is a lot to run a business, period. And I think especially when there's all these other things going on, it's challenging to sort of manage humans, manage yourself. And so there's a reason I think the average successful entrepreneur is 40 years old because it's just, there's a lot of stuff that goes on. Not to say it shouldn't happen or you should learn from it, but there's certainly a lot to do. Well, this has been super fun. It's sort of, and it's interesting to see and watch your journey as you've gone through navigating the process as an entrepreneur, as an author, and ultimately just as sort of a young person taking a different attack in life. And so it's been fun for me. And I do think your book is really, I liked a lot of what you said because I think that you really do, paint this message in Hacking Your Education all about like, do whatever you want, but just take ownership of what that is and know that like, just because you show up in a lecture every day and take the test and walk out doesn't learn anything, which I think is a big message you're trying to send there.
Totally. You can go to the gym every day and never get on the treadmill and you'll never lose weight.
Yeah. It's great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending quality time. And I'm sure this was hopefully interesting for others as it was for us to chat on.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for having me.